My name is Lance Mercereau, the Chief Marketing Officer at Rosslyn Analytics, and I'm your host today. I am joined by a well-known HR expert. Actually, we've got two of them, Dr. Max Blumberg of Blumberg Partnership, and Ed Houghton, Research Advisor, Human Capital and Metrics at the CIPD. I would like to ask Max to introduce himself.
And a very good afternoon. Thank you, Lance. Max Blumberg. I've been working in analytics for the past at least 10, 15, 20 years, and I am a research fellow at Goldsmiths University of London, where I look at the academic side. So I try and bring academic and practical together.
And hi, everybody. So I'm Edward Houghton. I'm a researcher for the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. And my real interest is in this idea of understanding the value of the workforce and how we can better use HR and people analytics to describe the nature of work and how our employees work with us in our organizations every single day. And it's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Max. Before we begin the formal part of the webinar, I would like to invite you to submit your most burning questions now and throughout our time together. So just use the tool on the webinar. That would be wonderful. And we will answer your questions at the end of the webinar during, I hope, will be a lively Q&A session with Max and Ed. So why are we here today? Well, it's to help you create more business value from your people using data and analytics. But you need much more than just data and analytics, which we'll discuss in the slides to come and also the conversation. So we're going to share our honest views and some tips to help you do your job better and more effectively. The life cycle of an employee is important to know. However, to understand the life cycle, you need to have the necessary insight at each step in the employee's journey. For most HR teams, getting data on a particular phase in the life cycle can be a challenge for a variety of reasons, including being unable to get your hands on that data. It's vital to get recruitment right because the cost is more than just HR's time and the expenditure in identifying, attracting, and onboarding candidates. The cost of a poor hire is huge, which we'll see in a few minutes. The most challenging and arguably the most rewarding is linking the different phases together in order to have a holistic view of your people and your organization. So, in preparation for this webinar, I came across this stat. 95% of companies admit to recruiting the wrong people. When I saw this, I was a bit amazed that people would actually admit this, but I'm actually proud that they did. But what is of concern, though, is if 95% recognize this is the problem, this is also very expensive or could be very expensive for companies. Now, I'm a marketer, but just like in marketing, if you put bad leads in at the top of a funnel, you'll not only waste time and effort, but you'll miss opportunities that could positively impact your organization. If you hire the wrong people, this will negatively affect your company. So it's vital to get this right from the beginning. Why do analytics? Why does it matter? Well, the benefits are huge when applied, from reducing the hiring cost to improving employee engagement and much more. Don't worry, we'll go through each of these today in greater detail for you to consider on how to bring these benefits to your organization. But it does start with getting data and analytics right, but it also is much more, as I've mentioned before. You've got to have the right skills and the right processes and much more, which my esteemed colleagues here, Ed and Max, will discuss in greater detail. But before we do that, I'd like to briefly talk about the cost of failure. It's easy for us all to understand the value of a good employee, right? I mean, you see this when a talented salesperson is able to close big deals very quickly, or an HR colleague has a knack for finding high caliber candidates with ease, or a marketer who generates leads cost effectively. This slide shows the cost of 5 common HR issues facing most companies. The numbers are based on a company, 100 million in revenue, payroll of 750 million, and an average salary per employee of around $19,000. So that's the basis. But using industry averages, you can see that these issues can total, or does cost, actually almost $600,000. That's a lot. So we're going to address how we can overcome these issues together. So the 4 questions that we're going to go into greater detail, amongst other questions that I hope that you do submit, are 1, how to establish an effective analytics program for recruiting the right people. How to establish an effective analytics program for retaining the right people. And what technology tools you need to effectively aggregate, improve, and manage data for analytics. That's a particular hot topic at the moment from conversations that we're having. And how to transform your HR organization by incorporating newfound people insight into processes. So let's start. I'd like to hand over to Ed to answer this question. Start it off.
Thank you, Lance. So this question of how to establish an effective analytics program for recruiting the right people is something that we've considered quite recently, actually, at the CIPD with our research with HR professionals. So in our work, we've looked across the HR profession of practicing HR professionals at different levels and stages in their careers, and we've asked them to consider exactly how they look to recruit the right talent into their organization. And in this particular question, we asked them to consider or share what they consider to be the most important considerations when recruiting and acquiring talent into their organization. So in this survey, we looked really closely at the perspectives of both HR and non-HR leaders in the organization. And as this slide kind of demonstrates, is in our current organizations, in the places that we work today, we really recruit for skills and competence. So we look to recruit talent into the organization which matches the competence we require to develop and grow as a business. We then look to attitudes and behaviors, and a very important consideration given the current context that organizations operate in is this idea of cultural fit. So do individuals fit with my organization, and are they going to provide or act with the correct behaviors to align with what the organization is looking to achieve? Now you'll see here there's a really good match between how HR leaders and non-HR leaders are considering these ideas. So the business is responding very positively to this need to recruit individuals who are highly skilled and have the skills matched to the job in hand, and also have the correct behavioral and cultural fit to the organization. What I find very interesting about this particular piece of work and the study that we did was that when we were recruiting, we looked less for high performance. So history of high performance is not necessarily an indicator of future high performance. So we as HR professionals and the business leaders that we're working with are looking to recruit on other attributes, not a history of a high-performing individual. And that's another very positive thing to take away, is that we're recruiting individuals who fit our organizations and who have the correct skills to be able to develop and grow in the business. We'll see a little bit later on the kind of considerations we make when we think about retaining high-quality talent in the organization.
Great. Thanks, Ed. So I just want to talk a little bit about what we might mean by a best practice process for recruiting the right people. At the outset, I think it's really important to say is that there isn't one size that fits all. If I've learned anything in analytics, I've learned that whatever you do needs to be adapted for your own organization. And the reason for that is that once you collect the first bit of data as part of a recruitment program, say you're looking at the competencies that Ed was talking about or the cultural fit, that piece of data might dictate what you need to do next. So don't let somebody come into your organization and say, here is the process that you need for recruiting. You've got to do some exploratory work, find out the context, the organizational need, and then base the process on what you've learned once you've done that. So the first broad category that you would need to do in any organization is to say, what does good look like in a particular role? When you're recruiting somebody, you'd need to say, so let's say that we're looking at Rosslyn Analytics, and Lance would like to recruit some salespeople, for example. He's got to have an idea of what a good sales performer looks like as opposed to a bad sales performer. Otherwise, there's no basis. A lot of companies say, we've analyzed our top 10 performers. Now, that sounds great, but the question is, what is it that makes those 10 performers, top 10, different from the bottom 10? And so you really need to look at a spectrum of what does good look like. Once you've done that, second step is to find out which of the factors that Ed spoke about earlier, the competencies, the organizational and cultural traits, which of those differentiate between high and low performers. So what Lance might do is he might go to the operational managers and say, what do you think it takes to be a great salesperson as defined in one? And they might say, I think it needs to be a great communicator, or I think it's someone who needs to do PowerPoint well. It's someone who needs to fit into a team. All of those are hypotheses. It doesn't matter whether HR knew what the hypotheses are. The real key in number 2, in my opinion, is that the operational managers define them rather than HR, or worse still, in my opinion, an external consultancy. If Lance were to use an external consultancy or HR to do that, the operational managers are unlikely to take seriously the recruitment process, because they're going to say, how do these people know how our business works and what it takes to sell around here? The third step now, you've got a number of hypothesized factors which distinguish between high and low, and this is where you might call in the statistician or the techie, if it's a large sample, to say, well, of those hypothesized factors, which do distinguish between high and low, and you might say that it is cultural fit, as Ed suggests, and that it is certain competencies like communication, etc. Once you've got those competencies that distinguish between high and low, you then build those into a recruitment process. So you might have a psychometric test. You might have a situational test that picks up, if let's say communication was important, you might ask candidates to do a presentation to look at their communication skills. So broadly, there are only 4 steps to try and create, or to create a reasonably good process for your organization. Back to you, Lance.
Thanks, Max. Let's look at the next question, how to establish an effective analytics program for retaining the right people. And I would like to hand over to Ed.
Thank you, Lance. So in the same study, we then moved on to talk a bit about the type of data that we need as professionals in our organizations to then retain the right talent in our organizations. If you cast your mind back to the slide previously about acquiring talent, you'll remember that high performance was at the bottom. Now, in this slide, you can see that high performance has now moved to the very top. And the implication for this as HR professionals is that if we're looking to understand how to retain individuals, we need to put in place the correct talent management and recruitment systems and retention systems that gather very clear performance data. So while skills and competence and cultural fit remain in the right level, actually it's important that we consider performance as the most important data to collect. Also interestingly on this slide is we now see loyalty and commitment as a data point that comes into the theme. So retaining individuals, both the business and HR requires data that describes commitment of individuals to organizations. And those of us who are on the call who are from high knowledge-based organizations will know that loyalty and commitment can be very difficult to achieve. Therefore, if we can create the right kind of environment and collect useful data about recruitment, retention, and commitment to the organization, we're then able to inform how both the business and HR works together. The useful point here as well is that non-HR leaders are finding this incredibly important. So it's those line managers that we work with every day who are very interested in this idea of commitment to the organization. So again, when speaking about retention data to those individuals in the organization, we must consider how we talk about commitment, because it's line managers who are most affected when we lose highly talented individuals.
So looking at the factors then which drive retention in the organization, I think that there are many ways you can look at retention. The most obvious answer is use any method that you want, but do it systematically. This little process is a modification from Jack Phillips. I don't know if any of you have come across Jack Phillips' work, but perhaps after this webinar, can I strongly recommend go onto Amazon, look up Jack Phillips, and one of his books in particular is called Investing in Your Human Capital, but he's got another book on retention as well, with some incredible processes and useful stuff in it. The Jack Phillips process is rather simple. What it's saying is that step one is you need to be monitoring the retention and attrition data in your organization, and you probably need to be monitoring it by function, by geography, by ethnic group, by gender, by performance, mainly so that you're not suddenly taken by surprise of some group in your organization leaving that you weren't aware of. Because the reasons that are making them leave may be an organizational issue and may come back to bite you at some point. The second step is to develop fully loaded costs of turnovers. I think by 2016, most of us know what that means, but let's just clarify. The cost of losing an employee is not just the cost of re-recruiting that employee. It's the cost of the training that you put into that employee that you've got to redo. It's the cost of the manager's time in interviewing the person. It's the cost of HR's time in processing the person. It's the cost of any CRB checks, of background checks. It's the cost of disruption to that person's team. It's the cost of disruption to the customer relationship if that was a client-facing person. The fully loaded cost is probably 3 to 4 times higher than the cost of rehiring the person. So you'll be grossly underestimating unless you look at fully loaded costs. There are tables available of fully loaded costs for different roles, engineers, middle managers, senior managers, etc. I have copies of those and can make them available to anybody that wants to see. The next thing to do is to diagnose the cause of the turnover. Again, a lot of people say that they use exit surveys to do that. I'm no fan of the exit survey. I was at an event with Ed last night where Ed was talking about the boomerang effect, which I rather liked, which is, you know, if I leave Google and I go to Apple, let's say, there's a reasonably good chance that I might end up back at Google in 3 years' time. Am I therefore going to burn my bridges at an exit survey by telling you the real reason that I left is that you didn't keep the career development promises or the salary promises that you made to me? So as a general rule, I would get somebody external to speak to people to find out why they're actually leaving your organization. It's terribly hard to do internally. You could try doing focus groups, but again, it depends who's running the focus group. Once you've got an idea of, for example, a particular organization I'm thinking of that we worked with, most of the people told us that it was career development issues, that all kinds of promises are made to attract you into the organization, but they are never kept. Once you've got that, it then gives you a steer that you need to revisit your career development or your training and development, whatever the process is that comes up. And finally, step 5 is before you go off and implement a company-wide and a huge solution, do test it somewhere in the organization in case it's not the right solution. I've seen people roll out global programs because some consultant told them that they should be doing it. And it was absolutely the wrong thing for the culture of that organization. So piloting and testing is absolutely crucial in the retention business. Back to you, Lance.
Great, thanks, Max. So let's go to our third question. What technology tools do you need to effectively aggregate, improve, manage data for analytics? Back to you, Max.
Okay, so in terms of the analytical tools, it's a very common question and a very obvious question. The way to think about it is, again, as I said with recruitment, there's no single formula where one size fits all. For example, some organizations have got a burning platform where they need something fixed. At that stage, you haven't got time to go through the formal rigmarole of setting up an enormous, Workday style, Oracle style, heaven forbid, Rosslyn data infrastructure. You need to be agile and quick and limber to get the thing going. However, if you are a larger organization, which I think is represented on the webinar today, you don't only want to be dealing with the burning platform, you probably do want to create an ongoing resource for your organization. If that's what you're doing, many organizations have found that the following steps are quite useful in terms of the order of doing things. Anecdotal decision making is probably how decisions are made pre-analytics by definition. The idea of analytics is not to take away intuition and gut feel, as some people accuse us of. It's to supplement anecdotal decision making. Human beings are fantastic data processors, and our intuition is right. What we want to do is supplement that with something more analytical. So the next thing that you'll do then, this is where you'll start thinking about gathering data. As anybody who's run an analytics project, and I think there are many of you on the call today, you will know that the hardest job in any analytics problem is pulling the data together. The actual analysis itself on SPSS or SAS or Oracle or whatever technical tool you're using is really quick. It's like it's a half a day or a day's work. Pulling the data together and cleaning it, the data, because the US people have been using a different system for performance rating and they're missing half the data. And Singapore formats their data in this way. It can take months and years. So the first step is get your data and your ducks together before you try and do any analysis on that. And typical tools, if you're a smaller organization, you could probably do a lot of that with Excel and do basic data reporting just using crystal reports. If you're pulling the data together in a larger organization, the cloud is obviously a way to move forward. It's cost effective, it's readily accessible, it allows you to interface between HR data and data from the rest of the organization, which I think at the moment is a huge limitation. We think of people analytics, which is often called HR analytics, as being somehow to do with HR. It's not. It's about how you contribute to making the operational data better in the organization. So once you've got the data together, step 3 is a lot of people find it's helpful to start having visualization tools so that you can start looking at patterns in the data. For example, where is performance going down? You'll start using graphical tools. Or what does a graph of US's attrition look like compared to UK attrition? And so that's where visualization comes in. Step 4 starts getting a little bit statistical, and it's at this point that we start using what we call correlational analysis. For example, if I increase my spend on training and development, what is the impact on my competencies as measured by my competency framework, or what is the impact on my performance? And it's actually a statistical measure called a correlation, which I'm sure many of you know about. That's the step that you get to, generally best done after you've got visualization. And the kind of tools that we use for that will be SPSS or SAS. You don't need to do anything too fancy on those. Sorry, I should have said with the visualization tools, by the way. The most common tools for those are probably Cognos, business objects. There's a computer language called R if you've got technical people. And of course, all of the vendor suites themselves, like Rosslyn, I know, have got a visualization tool. I know that McKinsey has got a visualization tool. Oracle, all of those come with their tools built in. After you've done correlational analysis, there's something called causal analysis. I think there are very few companies doing this effectively. I'd say globally at the moment, maybe 4 or 5%. And again, it's more about techniques and doing experiments in the organization, which we don't need to go into this afternoon. And finally, there's a level that I personally know of like 2 or 3 companies only that are doing it, and that's called prescriptive analytics, which is even deeper, and we probably can go into that as a separate subject. So back to you on that, Lance.
Thanks, Max. So the last question that we're going to go through here on this slide is how to transform your HR organization by incorporating newfound people insight into processes. And this is for you, Ed.
Thank you, Lance. So one of the things I think that we can sometimes feel in HR is that there's almost too much data, and it's very difficult to process and understand that within the context of your business. And so in our case studies that we publish through our research, we hear a lot about 2 main kind of ideas, really. One, which is the buy-in from the business. So you need to create a question that applies directly to something that's of an issue in the organization, and that will secure buy-in from your senior leaders and those peer groups that you're wanting to influence. And then secondly, you need to think about the capability to then generate some of these insights. And particularly when we think about, say, you are looking at recruitment and retention of talent, the people who benefit from this data are those people within the business. And so it's obviously incredibly logical to make sure that we are connecting with those individuals and understanding their perspective on some of these ideas. So whilst we could have all the data in the world, if we don't have the right relationships or capability to use that data, we won't be able to translate it into insight. So this survey, again, that we published really looks very closely at this idea of translating data into insight, and to those actors in the system, so those people in the business who then use that data, so ourselves as HR professionals, and then those business leaders who we influence. And what we found, so the graph or the diagram on the left-hand side shows there's a real discrepancy, really, when we use data. So the strategy that we use in our organizations to invest and grow our human capital, our talent, is often termed our people strategy. And data obviously forms a lot of the kind of the evidence behind that people strategy. But from our survey into what evidence goes into that strategy, we found out that non-HR leaders still don't quite understand the value of having a focused people strategy, particularly one that focuses on analytics and understanding evidence. Now, when we talk to HR leaders, we're obviously incredibly bought into that concept of the strategy and how valuable it is. So one thing I would say to take away is make sure you consider your people strategy, and make sure that you consider the people strategy alongside the business requirements. So everything the business needs, whether it is to do with talent recruitment and retention or any other HR issues, make sure that the talent strategy or the HR strategy is directly aligned to the business. The second point there is about improved capability. And again, we're really at the kind of maturing as a profession around this idea of using analytics. So in HR, we feel quite comfortable in doing some analytics, but we're still yet to see the business respond overly positively to the data that we generate. So we have to improve our capability. And on the right-hand side, you see that non-HR are really not bought in, and they don't understand the capability, and they're not satisfied with the data that we produce. So I don't want to be too bleak about this point, and I think it's actually quite a good point to take on the next point of the discussion about, is this idea of how we improve capability, and we can only do that really with the buy-in and the investment of the business. Okay. Now the next slide, losing my voice. The next slide, we talk about where we're going as a function and what the business requires from the analytics that we produce. And we talk a lot about predictive analytics and its value in looking at the future of people in our organizations. And we're very much on the same line with those business leaders in our organization. So both HR and the non-HR leaders that we surveyed agreed that predictive analytics is what we're wanting to achieve as professionals when we use data. Now, an interesting point about this slide is it shows a discrepancy between the perspectives on key HR metrics. And this is perhaps because we don't yet have standardized definitions for the measures we use in HR. It's clear here that non-HR leaders don't yet think that key metrics are essential when we're looking to achieve our strategic objectives. And this could particularly be to do with talent, if talent is the key issue in your organization. So whereas HR are clearly aligned in thinking that HR metrics need to be developed, we've still yet to consider the buy-in of those non-HR leaders to the importance of key HR data. One final point that I'll make about this particular slide is the importance of HR scorecards, particularly around benchmarking. I think there's a lot of work that we can do to demonstrate the value of benchmarks and the value of balanced scorecards when sharing those across our business. So I'd like to just continue to talk a bit more about what we're doing at the CIPD about this issue of understanding the value of talent and developing a new methodology for organizations to apply to consider the value of the people in their organizations and how they can work more closely to improve that value. So Valuing Your Talent is a program that we've developed alongside a number of other professional bodies. So Valuing Your Talent exists as an open source program that anybody can access and view, and it essentially is a library of different measures and metrics that we can use in our organizations to describe the value of our people. And we've been working alongside a number of different leading organizations to look at some of these case studies of how we can apply better analytics to answer real business issues. So please do take a look at the website. On there you'll find all sorts of case studies, and you'll also find on the website a framework that describes how you can apply some of these measures in your organization. There are case studies on there and measures on there that directly talk about the idea of recruiting and retaining talent in your organization. So please do take a look at the website and get involved in the initiative. It's a global piece of work, and we're really looking to work with as many HR professionals on this idea of valuing your talent for the future.
Thanks, Ed. So we're going to go right now into a few tips on how to help you answer some of those questions in greater detail. So I'd like to hand off to Max to start this off.
Thanks very much. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the best practices that we've picked up over the years of doing analytics. One of the first tips comes from a paper that, well articulated in the paper that IBM wrote called The First 100 Days a while back. And that is to start treating your analytics function as a business in its own right. Is it absolutely essential? Probably not. Is it a good idea? Absolutely. If you have a vision and a set of objectives for your analytics function, it'll probably provide some direction to what you're doing. Your vision might be something like ensuring that people make the maximum contribution to the organization. With a vision like that, it allows you to step back and to have a look at whatever you're doing so that you can ensure that you are not just working on issues that are important to HR but to the organization as a whole. So I think that is a good tip from that. The second point is about not using analytics unless you've got a real business problem that needs solving. In other words, don't use analytics because it is fashionable at the time. I read a lovely piece the other day from David Ulrich in a paper, Rasmussen and Ulrich, where he spoke about this organization where the analyst came up to them and said, we can now predict the attrition of any given employee with an accuracy of something like 90% or some ludicrous thing. They've taken 3 years to build this model, and when asked how much of a problem is attrition in the organization, apparently their employee turnover was something like 2%. So they didn't actually have an attrition problem, yet they worked for 3 years building a perfect model to solve it. So I think that analytics needs to be problem-driven. Right now we're in a stage where analytics is a very fashionable practice. People are doing analytics for its own sake. They're starting with the data, so they say we've got all of this data, what can we do with it, rather than saying what is the business problem that we're trying to solve, and then collecting data relevant to that problem. Bear in mind that is not a message that you're going to get from the technology vendors whose interest it is to make sure that you have got a place to store a lot of data. I'm not anti the idea of storing a lot of data. I think you have to do it. I think that setting out and building the data repository first without finding the problem that you need to populate is going to cost you a lot of money and a long time before you're going to see ROI on that. The next point comes back about culture, is something that Ed was talking about. HR for a long time has been an activity-based function. In other words, we're measured by how many recruits we process, or how much training we deliver, or are we delivering training on time, rather than how well are we delivering the training, or what is the performance of the people that we are recruiting. HR of all functions needs to start becoming more results oriented. Ed, would you agree with that?
I would certainly agree with that. So ROI, particularly in some of the interventions that we develop in HR, is so crucial when we're talking the language of business. So if we're trying to gain buy-in from those senior leaders in the organization, it's highly likely that what's going to tempt them to be interested is something that talks about the return on their investment. So we have to become really well versed in evaluating what we do as HR professionals, and then demonstrating the return on investment of all of the activities that we do. And so the culture, I think, of the way we approach analytics is now really all about looking at the results of what we do and finding the evidence that really proves the importance of the HR function and the value that we add. The next point about employee assets and costs is a really it's quite a philosophical debate, really. But this is something that we need to consider when we talk to our senior leaders about why they should invest in developing training and creating the right kind of environment for human capital in our organizations. And if we are to gain that investment, we have to demonstrate that investment requires an understanding of cost, and that actually employees and their knowledge is an asset to an organization. And I know a number of you on the call are in highly knowledge-based organizations, and for you to really change the dialogue in your organization, I'd certainly start thinking about talking about the human capital in your business as an asset, as something to be developed, because as Max pointed out earlier, this idea of the boomerang employee is something which is going to continue to make its way into the world of work. Younger generation or millennials are now really keen to gain experiences in all sorts of different settings, and so we have to become aware that the knowledge that they have is the asset to our organization, and therefore we need to view it in that way. The next point about analytics not being Big Brother.
Can I make a comment?
Sure, go for it, Mike.
Before you move on there. I would say that the single largest problem facing analytics, it's always a toss-up between starting with the data rather than starting with the problem. And the second one is, I don't believe that HR people understand enough about the business problem that they're trying to solve. And so we're talking about recruitment and retention today, for example. How well do HR people understand what the ideal recruit looks like in a given organization versus the operational manager understanding that? Unless HR has a deep understanding, how can HR influence the recruitment process and use analytics to find the ideal person? So from my perspective is that HR needs to have a very deep understanding of the business itself in order to be able to add value and link people data to business outcome data. Would you agree with that?
I completely agree with that. I think that's a really useful point to make.
But how does it happen, Ed? How does one take HR, which has traditionally not been a business or an operational function, how does one get HR people to learn more about the business outcomes that are required rather than about HR outcomes?
So I think it's all about how you train and recruit into the function. So you have to consider the skills and competencies of those who are training to be HR professionals. And as the professional body for HR, we've recognized that new skills are coming into the profession. And so actually, if you're a practicing HR professional, I would certainly take a bit of a tour of duty approach. So make sure your new recruits into your HR team do get some time out and about in the organization, understanding real business issues, because it's all too easy for us to think about the HR black box and solve our own problems for our own reasons and not consider how this impacts the rest of the organization. And so what we need to do as HR professionals is open ourselves up to having that dialogue with the rest of the organization and being open to the challenge that that may create. It's all about understanding the organization and what it works for. And so to me, I think those relationships are so crucial.
Without that, you can't make analytics work.
No.
Because otherwise, HR are going to be working with one set of data, the people data, and the operation is going to be working with another set of data, which is the transactional data of the organization, without real insight into the operations. The HR people haven't got insight into both sets of data. In much the same way, your operational people, as you pointed out earlier, Ed, don't have much insight into what goes on in HR. You know, if they understood what HR does, they would probably have a greater need to say, well, we need to give HR people more information about our people, more data about our people, about their behavior and their performance, so that HR can help to do more effective people analytics. So there's something about the culture and the bridging.
And I'm just curious, how would you facilitate the collection or enabling the collection of that information and pushing it back into HR for use?
I have something that I've used a couple of times, again, a Jack Phillips idea, which is called the People Metrics Workshop for Operational Managers. If you find my profile on LinkedIn, you'll see I've just written an article about that. In fact, you could just go to maxb.com, which takes you to my LinkedIn profile. But the idea is that HR hosts or facilitates a workshop for operational managers and asks them what are the competencies required for the roles, what does good performance look like, and by letting the operational managers articulate what those metrics are, HR starts developing more insight, and operations feels that it has more say in the recruitment and the training of its people, instead of training being this burden where you have to lose productivity and where somebody in HR who doesn't understand what we're doing is doing the recruitment of the people. So the workshop facilitated by HR, and again, probably, do it internally. HR's role is the facilitation role. So that's how, Lance, that's how I would do it.
On a related question, do you see HR moving into developing centers of analytics or centers of innovation that leverages the data and the people?
I would say it has to. We can't not do that. I think we have to invest as a function in creating those centers for doing analytics, because what would worry me is if this skill or competency or technology sits too far outside HR, because the HR professional brings all of their understanding and judgment to being able to understand analytics and people. And if too much of this data or judgment is taken away from the professional in the system, then I would question the efficacy and the ability of those people making decisions without consulting with HR. Now, you work alongside those systems and you ensure that there are systems that you are contributing to and leveraging, but always within the system you have to have a competent HR professional.
Okay. And if you were advising an HR team or a leader to establish, who would you recommend they work with to bring that function together from a analytics?
I'm a great fan of the multifunctional team. I don't believe that HR needs its own analytics function. I believe that there is a corporate analytics function. Without that, I think you're going into you're lending yourself to a silo mentality. I believe that there needs to be a human capital or an HR expert on the team. There needs to be a marketing expert, there needs to be an operations expert on the multidisciplinary team, and that that is more likely to break down data silos. It's hard enough within HR getting hold of training and development data for the HRD to get hold of the training and development data and the recruitment data within the HR function. You can only imagine, as all of you will know on the call, how difficult it is to pull in information from outside of HR as doing that. So I think one way is a multidisciplinary team.
Excellent. Well, conscious of time, let us go into, we've got loads of questions. I don't think we're going to have time to answer them all, but if we don't, which we will definitely come back to you with answers. A couple of the questions that have come through. One here is, how do I identify the risk of losing good employees?
So, I mean, that's a fairly, it's a fairly standard modeling problem today. You can use, there are various machine learning techniques for doing that, but effectively it just says, look at your existing employees and try and distinguish what are the factors that differentiate between employees that leave the organization and employees that stay in the organization. So one company we were working with recently, a construction company, quite obviously discovered that a lot of females between the ages of 29 and 33 were leaving the organization. Now some people might say, well, that's a bit of a no-brainer. But when you looked at the graph to try and show you that, a little bit of visual analysis became really obvious. They also discovered that they were losing people from a certain part of the country. They found out that people with certain educations were leaving. So the answer to that is that a good bit of visualization and looking at patterns in the data without using much statistics can actually help you to do a lot of insight and identification into why you're losing employees.
Well, thanks, Max. That was good. I'm going to have time for like one more question.
Sure.
How do you make, or how can you help me make the business case for analytics?
So it's the dialogue with the business. Number one, go talk to the business, find out what the issue is, then go and talk to your HR team and find out what the capability is, and map and build that map, build that stakeholder map, and tick them all off. Go and speak to everybody to work out the issue, and then make sure that you build a project or a program of work which is very well staged, which is very well managed, that has very clear points where you deliver against the project, and ensure that you adequately cost for the work that you're doing. Yeah. The main thing I think that many HR professionals maybe fall down on is they see the question as being too big to tackle, and they go straight for that. They don't break it down into actually what could lead them towards exploring the question in more detail. And so spend a bit of time. You as an HR professional have a lot of knowledge about your organization, so diagnose the issue first with your knowledge, and then start to really sense check that with your colleagues, sense check that with the experts in your organization, before then going deep into how you may tackle that issue and answer that question. So the business case has to be so tied to what the organization wants. And if you're able to do that, by creating that network, you then have the people who can advise you on how to develop the project moving forward. And it's all then about relationship management, making sure that you have the right relationships that are effectively feeding the work that you do.
And also, you don't have to focus on tangible, measurable financial benefits all the time. Sometimes improving the culture or reducing bullying in an organization, for example, so you use analytics to analyze levels of bullying, and you discover that we are now losing 10% less employees because of bullying, and we've worked out earlier from our fully loaded costs, the cost of losing an employee. But there might also be something about an increase in morale in the organization, so that if you do an engagement survey of some kind, you may find that because bullying is reduced, engagement increases by 30%. You need to report that as part of the ROI. It may not have a dollar value attached to it, but it is really important ROI for the board to understand that. So the answer is, where you can find hard financial figures, and it's tricky to do that in many cases, at least look at the soft intangibles and go out and measure them before and after you do people analytics projects.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I want to say a huge thank you to Ed and to Max for preparing and for participating today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's attended. We will send out the slides to everyone. So without any more thank yous, thank you once again, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you.